Death is usually the end of the story, but sometimes it becomes the beginning of one. Scattered across ancient rock layers are moments frozen in time, creatures caught mid-hunt, animals buried alive in volcanic ash, predators locked in combat with prey they never finish killing, mothers dying while giving birth, and hunters becoming the hunted in their final seconds. These aren't just fossils, they're crime scenes from deep time, accidents preserved for eternity, and final moments captured in stone. The fossil record doesn't just show us what ancient life looked like, it shows us how it ended, often in ways so violent, so sudden, and so bizarre that they read like scenes from a disaster movie written by evolution itself. From fighting dinosaurs frozen mid-battle to fish choked by their own prey. From mass graves where thousands died together to solitary deaths that tell intimate stories of struggle, these fossils reveal the raw, unfiltered chaos of survival in worlds that no longer exist. This is the story of the strangest prehistoric deaths ever preserved. Moments when tragedy became immortality and the end became a window into vanished worlds. The fighting dinosaurs of Mongolia. In the red sandstone badlands of Mongolia's Gobi Desert, paleontologists discovered what might be the most dramatic death scene ever preserved in rock. Two dinosaurs locked in mortal combat, frozen at the exact moment of their final struggle. The specimen, discovered in 1971, shows a velociraptor and a protoceratops entangled together, their bodies positioned exactly as they were when death took them both simultaneously. The velociraptor's killing claw is embedded deep in the protoceratops's throat, while the herbivore's powerful beak has clamped shut around the predator's arm, crushing bone. Neither animal had time to escape. Neither had time to even separate before a catastrophic sandstorm or collapsing dune buried them alive, preserving their final seconds for 75 million years. The preservation quality is extraordinary. Individual bones remain articulated in fighting positions. The velociraptor's legs are drawn up, suggesting it was using its infamous foot claws to disembowel its prey. Exactly the hunting technique scientists had theorized but never confirmed. The protoceratops shows defensive injuries consistent with a desperate struggle. Its frill has bite marks. Its body is twisted at an angle that suggests it was thrashing, trying to throw off its attacker. Both animals died with their bodies tensed, muscles contracted in their final efforts to either kill or survive. What makes this discovery so scientifically valuable is the behavioral information it provides. Before this fossil, the hunting strategies of dromaeosaurs like Velociraptor were based on speculation and comparative anatomy. This specimen confirmed that these predators did indeed use their enlarged toe claws as primary weapons, slashing at vital areas while gripping with their hands. It also revealed that Protoceratops, despite lacking horns, was no easy target. Its beak was powerful enough to crush arm bones, and it fought back with lethal force. The fossil captures predation as it actually happened. Not a clean, movie-style kill, but a chaotic, desperate fight where both animals risked everything. The circumstances of their burial add another layer to the mystery. The most accepted hypothesis suggests a sudden sandstorm or dune collapse smothered both animals before either could break free. The Gobi Desert during the Cretaceous was an arid, dune-covered landscape, prone to violent sand movements. Dunes could shift within minutes during storms, creating avalanche-like flows that buried anything in their path. Both dinosaurs may have been caught in exactly such an event, their battle interrupted not by victory or escape, but by thousands of tons of sand pouring over them, filling their lungs and eyes, crushing them together in a death grip that would last epochs. Other theories have been proposed. Some researchers suggest a flash flood might have drowned both animals while they fought in or near a stream bed. Others have considered the possibility of a burrow collapse, though the sediment structure doesn't support this. The most compelling evidence points toward rapid burial in fine-grained sand that infiltrated every gap between bones, preserving even delicate structures like the velociraptor's arms in three-dimensional detail. Whatever the mechanism, It happened fast, so fast that scavengers never arrived and the bodies never separated. The fossil also challenges simplified predator-prey narratives. This wasn't a case of a predator successfully hunting and feeding. The velociraptor died in the act of trying to kill. It never fed, never escaped, never even released its grip. The protoceratops died fighting rather than fleeing. Both animals paid the ultimate price for their encounter, and neither achieved its goal. It's a reminder that in nature, hunts often fail. Predators regularly die trying, and prey sometimes take their attackers down with them. Evolution doesn't guarantee success. It only rewards those who survive long enough to reproduce, and in this case, neither animal would. Subsequent studies using CT scanning technology have revealed even more details. The velociraptor's skull shows stress fractures consistent with the impact of being bitten and shaken by the protoceratops. The herbivore's neck vertebrae show damage where the killing claw penetrated, but not enough to sever the spinal cord instantly. This suggests the protoceratops remained conscious and fighting even as it was being fatally wounded, a testament to the raw survival instinct driving both animals. Their deaths weren't quick or painless. They were prolonged, violent, and desperately fought. The specimen remains one of the most studied fossils in paleontology. Museums worldwide have created casts of the fighting pair, and the original sites in Mongolia's natural history collections as a national treasure. Scientists continue to analyze the fossil using new imaging techniques, finding subtle details about bone structure, muscle attachment, and fighting posture that earlier studies missed. Each examination reveals more about how these animals moved, fought, and ultimately died together in the ancient desert. The fighting dinosaurs aren't just a fossil, they're a snapshot of evolution's brutal theatre, where survival is earned through violence and death comes without warning. Buried alive in volcanic ash. Few deaths in the fossil record are as sudden and catastrophic as those caused by volcanic eruptions. In numerous locations worldwide, paleontologists have discovered fossil graveyards where hundreds or thousands of animals died simultaneously, buried under meters of volcanic ash in events so rapid that victims had no time to flee, no time to seek shelter, and in many cases no time to even change position before death arrived. These mass burials create windows into ancient ecosystems, preserving entire communities exactly as they existed at single moments in deep time. The most famous of these sites is in northeastern China, where the Jahol biota preserves early Cretaceous life from approximately 125 million years ago. Multiple layers of volcanic ash, each representing a separate eruption, entombed thousands of animals, including early birds, feathered dinosaurs, mammals, and insects. The preservation is so exceptional that feathers, fur, and even stomach contents remain visible in many specimens. These weren't animals that died and then slowly fossilized. They were alive one moment and encased in hot ash the next, their bodies buried so quickly that decay never began. The mechanism of death in these eruptions was horrific. When volcanoes produce pyroclastic flows, superheated clouds of ash, gas, and rock fragments, the flows race downslope at speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, with temperatures reaching 700 degrees Celsius. Nothing in their path survives. Animals caught in these flows die from heat shock, asphyxiation, or physical trauma within seconds. The ash that kills them also preserves them, settling in layers meters thick and sealing bodies away from scavengers, bacteria, and weathering. Within hours, what was a thriving forest becomes a sterile ash field, and within millennia, that ash field becomes a fossil treasure trove. One specimen from the Jahol deposits shows a small mammal curled in a sleeping position, suggesting it died at night when the eruption struck. Its tiny skeleton remains articulated, with delicate finger bones still in place and fur impressions surrounding the body. Another fossil preserves a bird in flight position, wings extended, caught by ash while airborne and fossilized mid-flight. The bird's feathers show individual barbs and barbules under microscopic examination. These aren't reconstructions or interpretations. They're direct records of animals killed so quickly they didn't even have time to assume defensive postures. Scientists studying these deposits have found evidence of multiple eruptions separated by years or decades. Each ash layer represents a separate catastrophe that reset the local ecosystem. Between eruptions, life returned, recolonized the ash-covered landscape, and began rebuilding communities, only to be destroyed again by the next eruption. This created a repeating cycle of extinction and recolonization, captured in the rock record as alternating layers of ash and sediment, each containing fossils of the animals that briefly thrived before the next disaster struck. The information preserved in volcanic death assemblages extends beyond individual anatomy. Scientists can identify which species lived together, which habitats they preferred, and even which season the eruption occurred by examining plant fossils and growth rings. Some deposits preserve insects that only emerge during specific months, pinpointing eruption timing with remarkable precision. Others show animals that lived in different habitats: forest dwellers, stream species, and open ground animals, all mixed together by the chaos of the eruption, providing rare glimpses of entire ecosystem compositions. One particularly dramatic find from Nebraska's ashfall fossil beds shows a herd of prehistoric rhinoceroses that died together during a volcanic eruption approximately 12 million years ago. The ash came from a supervolcano eruption in present-day Idaho, nearly 1,000 miles away, demonstrating the massive reach of major volcanic events. The rhinoceroses didn't die immediately from heat or impact. They died slowly over days or weeks from inhaling fine volcanic glass particles that shredded their lungs and caused fatal respiratory distress. Their skeletons show signs of prolonged suffering, abrasion marks on teeth from desperately grazing on ash-coated plants, bone lesions from immune system stress, and remains of mothers still standing over their dead calves when they finally collapsed. The ashfall deposit preserves complete skeletons in death poses that tell individual stories. Some animals died standing up, their legs locked in rigor mortis, and fell over only when decomposition weakened their joints. Others are found lying down with their heads thrown back, a position indicating respiratory distress and suffocation. Baby rhinoceroses lie curled against their mothers. Adult males show evidence of continuing to fight for dominance, even as they died. Two skeletons are found with their horns interlocked, suggesting they were fighting when the ash finally killed them both. These volcanic death assemblages have revolutionized paleontology by providing population-level data that isolated fossils cannot. Scientists can calculate age distributions, sex ratios, and social structures by examining entire herds preserved together. They can identify diseases and injuries that affected prehistoric populations. They can determine whether species were social or solitary, whether they provided parental care, and how they responded to environmental catastrophes. The ash that killed these animals also gave science an unparalleled gift: complete snapshots of ancient life, captured in its final moments, preserved in three-dimensional detail, waiting millions of years to tell its story. The mother's final moment. Among the most emotionally resonant fossils are those preserving mothers who died while giving birth, intimate tragedies frozen in stone that reveal both the universality of reproductive struggle and the harsh realities of prehistoric life. These fossils are exceptionally rare because the circumstances required for their preservation are very specific. The mother must die during active labor, must be buried rapidly enough to prevent scavenging, and must remain undisturbed long enough for fossilization to occur. When all these conditions align, the result is a fossil that captures one of biology's most fundamental processes interrupted by death. The most famous example comes from Germany's Holzmaden shale deposits, where a pregnant ichthyosaur, a dolphin-like marine reptile, was fossilized while giving birth. The specimen shows the mother's skeleton with several babies still inside her body cavity, and one baby emerging from the birth canal, its tiny skull positioned exactly where it would have been during delivery. The baby never completed its journey into the world. Mother and offspring died together, likely from complications during a difficult birth or from sudden environmental changes that killed them before the process could finish. Ichthyosaurs gave live birth rather than laying eggs, an adaptation to their fully aquatic lifestyle. Birth typically occurred tail first, the opposite of most mammals, to prevent drowning during delivery. Fossil evidence shows this species usually gave birth to 6 to 8 babies in a single litter. The Holzmarden specimen's tragedy appears to have resulted from a breech presentation, where the baby emerged head first rather than tail first. This would have exposed the newborn's airway to water before its body fully exited, causing drowning. The mother may have died from exhaustion, blood loss, or complications arising from the abnormal birth position. Similar fossils have been found in other marine reptile species. A mosasaur from South Dakota preserves a mother with 2 babies visible in her body cavity, though whether she was pregnant at death or had cannibalized juveniles remains debated among researchers. A plesiosaur from Kansas shows embryonic bones within the mother's ribcage, confirming these animals also gave live birth. Each specimen adds detail to our understanding of prehistoric reproduction: how many offspring were typical, how developed babies were at birth, and what could go wrong during the process. Terrestrial examples are even rarer, but equally dramatic. A fossil from Montana preserves a small dinosaur called Sittipati, brooding over a nest of eggs, its arms spread across the clutch in a protective posture. This wasn't death during birth, but death during parental care. The adult was covering the eggs when a sandstorm or dune collapse buried the entire nest. The eggs beneath the parent show embryonic skeletons at various developmental stages, revealing that dinosaur eggs didn't all hatch simultaneously, but over a period of days, requiring extended parental supervision. This fossil changed scientific understanding of dinosaur behavior, proving that at least some species provided active nest protection rather than simply laying eggs and abandoning them. Mammal fossils occasionally preserve births in progress as well. A Miocene-age horse from Nebraska died with a foal skeleton positioned in the birth canal, its tiny bones perfectly articulated within the mother's pelvis. Analysis of the foal's development suggests it was full-term and positioned correctly for delivery, meaning something went catastrophically wrong during labor, possibly a disproportion between the foal's head size and the mother's birth canal, or perhaps exhaustion or bleeding. The mother and foal were buried together in river sediments that rapidly covered them, preventing scavenging and preserving the entire tragic event. These death during birth fossils reveal that obstetric complications aren't modern problems. They're ancient evolutionary challenges that have killed mothers throughout vertebrate history. Large-headed babies, narrow birth canals, breech positions, exhaustion, infection, and hemorrhage have claimed maternal lives across hundreds of millions of years. The difference between ancient and modern times isn't whether birth was dangerous, it always has been, but whether medical intervention could save mothers and babies when complications arose. Scientists studying these fossils use them to understand prehistoric reproductive biology. By examining the development stage of unborn offspring, researchers can determine gestation lengths. By counting offspring numbers, they can estimate reproductive rates. By analysing birth canal dimensions and baby skull sizes, they can calculate the biomechanical limits of prehistoric birth. Some species clearly evolved relatively easy births with small-headed offspring, while others pushed the limits of what was physically possible, resulting in high maternal mortality rates, but producing offspring with advantages like larger brains or more developed bodies at birth. The preservation of these intimate moments also provides glimpses into prehistoric behaviour and ecology. A mother ichthyosaur dying during birth suggests she remained in relatively shallow waters during labour, where she was more vulnerable to rapid burial by sediments, but perhaps felt safer from large predators. A nesting dinosaur remaining on eggs during a deadly sandstorm reveals how strongly parental instincts drove behaviour. the parent chose to stay and protect rather than flee to safety. These aren't abstract evolutionary principles, but real decisions made by real animals in their final moments. Decisions that cost them their lives, but that also demonstrate the strength of reproductive and parental drives that evolution hardwired into their nervous systems across millions of generations. Death by drowning in ancient deserts. The fossil record contains numerous examples of animals that drowned, not in oceans or lakes where drowning seems obvious, but in ancient deserts, in places that are now among Earth's driest landscapes. These fossils tell stories of flash floods, quicksand traps, and sudden inundations that transform stable ground into deadly liquid hazards within minutes, killing anything too slow to escape. The preserved death struggles show animals in positions of desperate effort, legs extended in final swimming motions, bodies contorted from thrashing, heads thrown back in attempts to keep airways above water that rose too fast to outrun. One of the most significant collections of drowning deaths comes from Ghost Ranch in New Mexico, where hundreds of Coelophysis dinosaurs died together in what appears to have been a catastrophic flood event approximately 208 million years ago. The fossils are jumbled together in a deposit called a bone bed, with adults, juveniles, and hatchlings all mixed in chaotic positions. Some skeletons are complete and articulated, suggesting these individuals were buried rapidly. Others are disarticulated, torn apart by floodwaters before burial. The orientation of bones follows water current directions, indicating the animals were swept along and deposited together as the flood subsided. The Ghost Ranch deposit preserves what paleontologists call a catastrophic death assemblage, a large group killed simultaneously by a single event. Analysis of the sediments reveals they were deposited by a massive flood that occurred during a rainy season in an otherwise arid environment. The Coelophysis population, possibly a herd or a group gathered at a water source, was caught when distant storms sent a wall of water rushing through the valley. The dinosaurs had nowhere to run. The flood was too wide, too fast, and too powerful. Within minutes, hundreds were dead, their bodies carried downstream and dumped together in a jumbled mass that would slowly become stone. Similar drowning assemblages have been found worldwide. In Argentina, a site called Pisano preserves dozens of dinosaurs that died trying to cross a river during flood conditions. Their skeletons are oriented in the same direction, suggesting they were all moving together when the current swept them away. Some are complete, others are scattered over wide areas, torn apart by the violence of the water. Bite marks on some bones suggest that survivors fed on the dead, and that scavengers arrived once water levels dropped. Another dramatic example comes from Australia's dinosaur graveyards, where deposits preserve dozens of small dinosaurs apparently trapped in quicksand-like mud. The animals are found standing upright, with their legs buried deep in sediment and their upper bodies relatively free, suggesting they became mired and couldn't extract themselves. As they struggled, they sank deeper, eventually suffocating or dying from exposure. Some fossils show animals that reached over 90% burial before death, with only their heads and necks protruding. Others died early in the process, their full bodies preserved in desperate struggling poses. Modern analogues help explain these ancient deaths. Flash floods in desert regions regularly kill wildlife by the hundreds. Animals gather at water sources during dry periods, and when storms strike in distant highlands, walls of water arrive with little warning. Riverbeds that have been dry for months suddenly fill with raging torrents 10 feet deep. Ground that seemed solid becomes bottomless mud. Animals caught in these events have essentially no chance of survival. They drown, are battered against rocks, or are buried alive in sediment that flows like concrete. The fossil evidence shows ancient environments were equally treacherous. Sediment analysis from drowning sites reveals rapid deposition sequences, thick layers of sand and mud laid down in hours rather than years, preserving whatever was caught in the flow. Some deposits show multiple flooding events, each burying a new generation of victims, suggesting certain locations were chronic death traps that repeatedly claim lives during seasonal flood cycles. One particularly unusual drowning site in Montana preserves a diverse assemblage, including dinosaurs, crocodiles, turtles, and fish, species that lived in different habitats but were brought together by flooding. The crocodiles and turtles are species that normally live in rivers and swamps. The dinosaurs were terrestrial. The fish were from quiet backwaters. All were swept up during a massive flood that temporarily merged multiple ecosystems into a single death zone, then deposited the victims together in one chaotic jumble. This mixing of fauna from different environments is diagnostic of flood deposits and helps paleontologists identify drowning as the cause of death. Scientists studying these assemblages can reconstruct precise sequences of events. Initial floodwaters scoured channels and picked up animals. As the flood progressed, water velocity decreased and animals began settling out, the largest and heaviest first, smaller and lighter individuals later. Finally, as the flood subsided completely, fine sediments buried everything in a protective layer. Within days, the site transformed from a raging river to a quiet mudflat. Within years, minerals began replacing organic material. Within millions of years, tragedy became treasure, a fossil assemblage, preserving the final moments of ancient animals caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The predator becomes prey. Evolution creates predators optimized for killing, but the fossil record reveals that even apex hunters regularly died violent deaths, often at the jaws of animals they themselves preyed upon, or from competitors who saw them not as threats, but as meals. These fossils capture moments when the predatory hierarchy broke down, when hunters became hunted, and when creatures at the top of food chains discovered they weren't quite as invincible as their adaptation suggested. One of the most striking examples comes from Madagascar, where a fossil of the crocodile-like predator, Mahajangasuchus, preserves bite marks from a contemporary theropod dinosaur called Majungasaurus. The crocodilian was approximately 5 meters long, a formidable predator that normally hunted along riverbanks. But the bite marks show the dinosaur attacked and fed on the crocodilian, leaving tooth-gouged bones and feeding traces that match Majungasaurus' jaw anatomy perfectly. This wasn't scavenging of an already dead animal. The bite force and repetitive marking patterns suggest active predation. The predatory dinosaur hunted and killed a predatory crocodilian, demonstrating that even specialized hunters could become prey when they encountered something larger and more aggressive. Another dramatic fossil from Germany shows a small pterosaur preserved inside the stomach of a predatory fish. Pterosaurs were flying reptiles that typically caught fish from the air by skimming water surfaces with their beaks. This particular pterosaur apparently flew too close or misjudged its dive, allowing a large predatory fish to leap from the water and catch it. The fish swallowed the pterosaur whole, or nearly so, as wing bones still protruded from the fish's mouth when both animals fossilized. The predator became prey in a split-second reversal. Killed by an animal it was hunting. The most extensive evidence of predators dying violently comes from tyrannosaur fossils, showing that these apex predators regularly fought each other. Multiple Tyrannosaurus rex specimens preserve healed bite marks that match T-Rex tooth dimensions, proving these animals survived attacks from their own species. But other specimens show unhealed wounds that proved fatal. One T-Rex skeleton from Montana has a broken leg that became infected, leaving distinctive bone lesions showing the infection was active at death. Unable to hunt effectively with a crippled leg, the animal likely starved. An apex predator brought down not by another predator, but by an injury that cost it mobility. Face biting appears to have been common among tyrannosaurs. Multiple skulls show puncture wounds and gouges on the snout and jaws, matching the tooth spacing of other tyrannosaurs. Scientists interpret these as combat wounds from intraspecific fighting, battles for territory, mates, or dominance. Most wounds healed, but some were fatal. One juvenile Tyrannosaurus specimen shows catastrophic skull damage that penetrated the brain case, causing immediate death. The attacker was almost certainly another tyrannosaur, suggesting even young T-Rex weren't safe from their own kind. Similar patterns appear in other predatory species. Allosaurus fossils frequently show bite marks from other Allosaurus. Crocodilian fossils regularly preserve evidence of attacks from rival crocodilians. Saber-toothed cat skeletons show wounds inflicted by other saber-toothed cats. The predatory lifestyle created constant opportunities for violent death, whether from prey fighting back, from competitors eliminating rivals, or from injuries sustained during hunts that later became infected or debilitating. One particularly detailed case study involves a Deinonychus, a raptor dinosaur, whose fossilized bones show evidence of being fed upon by another Deinonychus. The bite marks are precisely sized to match Deinonychus teeth, and the feeding pattern shows systematic dismemberment consistent with predation rather than scavenging. Whether this represents cannibalism, opportunistic feeding on an already dead rival, or active hunting of injured pack members remains uncertain, but it demonstrates that even social predators weren't safe from their own species. The fossil record also preserves predators killed by prey. A velociraptor specimen from Mongolia shows severe injuries consistent with being kicked by a herbivorous dinosaur. The damage to the predator's ribcage suggests a powerful impact that likely caused fatal internal injuries. The velociraptor died not from starvation or disease, but from attempting to hunt an animal that defended itself successfully. This fossil reminds us that herbivores weren't helpless victims. They evolved formidable defenses, and those defenses regularly killed predators. Marine environments show the same patterns. Mosasaur fossils sometimes preserve shark bite marks, indicating these marine reptiles faced predation from large sharks, despite being apex predators themselves. Conversely, shark fossils occasionally show mosasaur bite marks, proving the relationship wasn't one-sided. Large, predatory fish fossils show wounds from other large predatory fish. The ocean's food web was a constant battlefield where yesterday's hunter became today's meal with depressing regularity. These fossils collectively demonstrate that predatory life was extraordinarily dangerous for predators themselves. Being adapted to kill didn't guarantee safety. It often meant engaging in risky behaviours that led to injury and death. Hunting required approaching dangerous prey. Maintaining territories meant fighting rivals. Competition for resources forced confrontations with animals equally well armed. The result was high mortality among predators, with many dying violently at the hands or teeth of other predators or from injuries sustained while hunting. The fossil record preserves these deaths as reminders that evolution doesn't create safe, easy lives for any species, only strategies that occasionally work well enough to pass genes forward before death arrives. Trapped in tar for eternity. Few death traps in prehistoric history were as consistently deadly as tar pits, natural seeps of thick petroleum that pooled on the surface, looking deceptively like water, but functioning as inescapable quicksand that captured and killed thousands of animals over millennia. The most famous of these death traps is the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, where excavations have recovered more than 3.5 million fossils, representing over 600 species, making it one of the richest fossil sites in the world. The animals preserved there died horrible, slow deaths, trapped, struggling, and eventually drowning or succumbing to exposure, while predators and scavengers circled, sometimes becoming victims themselves. The mechanism that made tar pits so deadly was simple but devastatingly effective. Asphalt seeps occurred where petroleum deposits reached the surface. During hot weather, the tar softened and flowed slowly across the ground. Rainwater pooled on the surface, creating what appeared to be normal drinking ponds. Animals approaching for water stepped onto what seemed like solid ground around the pool's edge, only to find their feet sinking into thick, adhesive tar. Struggling made things worse. Each movement drove legs deeper into the viscous trap. Small animals died within hours. Larger animals could remain trapped for days, slowly weakening until they could no longer keep their heads above the tar surface. The La Brea deposits preserve the full spectrum of this tragedy. Excavations have uncovered dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, ground sloths, mammoths, bison, camels, horses, and hundreds of bird species. But the most abundant fossils by far are predators, especially dire wolves and saber-toothed cats. Paleontologists have recovered thousands of dire wolf skeletons from La Brea, far more than herbivore skeletons. This imbalance tells a dark story. Predators saw trapped herbivores as easy meals and approached to feed, only to become trapped themselves. Some predator fossils show stomach contents that include remains of trapped prey, proving they died while feeding on earlier victims. The tar preserved bones with exceptional quality because the asphalt's chemical properties prevented decomposition. Bacteria couldn't break down organic material submerged in petroleum. Oxygen couldn't reach buried carcasses. As a result, bones remained intact and completely articulated, allowing paleontologists to recover complete skeletons, including delicate elements like hyoid bones, toe bones, and even stomach contents. The chemical environment also preserves some soft tissues, including remnants of skin, fur, and in rare cases muscle tissue, providing direct evidence of prehistoric animal appearances and biology. Individual fossils tell personal stories of final struggles. One dire wolf skeleton shows worn teeth and extensive arthritis, suggesting an old animal that could no longer hunt effectively and resorted to scavenging at the tar pits. A saber-toothed cat fossil preserves a healed fracture in its forearm, indicating this individual survived a serious injury but eventually died in the tar, possibly because the healed fracture limited its hunting ability, forcing it to take risks at the seeps. A mammoth skeleton includes a baby trapped alongside its mother, suggesting family groups approached the water together, and when one became stuck, others stayed nearby, compassion leading to their own deaths. Scientists studying La Brea fossils have reconstructed detailed population structures and life histories. By examining bone growth patterns, they can determine ages at death. By analysing teeth wear, they can assess diet and feeding behaviour. By studying pathologies, diseases, injuries, and infections, they can understand health issues in prehistoric populations. One dire wolf study found that approximately 70% of adult specimens showed evidence of significant injuries during life, with fractured ribs, broken legs, and skull trauma being common. This suggests dire wolf life was extraordinarily violent, even before the tar pits claimed victims. The tar pits also preserve evidence of ecosystem structure. The abundance of predator fossils relative to prey suggests the late Pleistocene landscape supported large predator populations, possibly because prey was abundant enough to sustain them. The presence of specialized scavengers like extinct vultures and teratons, giant birds with wingspans exceeding 3 meters, indicates that death was common enough to support animals that fed exclusively on carcasses. The diversity of trapped species reveals that the region supported varied habitats, from grasslands to woodlands, each hosting distinct animal communities. Other tar seep sites exist worldwide, though none match La Brea's richness. Carpinteria in California preserves marine mammals that became trapped when seeps occurred underwater. Rancho La Brea's sister site in Ecuador, Talara Tar Seeps, contains South American fauna, including giant ground sloths and terror birds. Poland's Starunia site preserved a nearly complete woolly rhinoceros in asphalt. Each location operated on the same deadly principle. Petroleum seeps created attractive nuisances that lured animals to death. The trap efficiency at La Brea was remarkably high during certain periods. Radiocarbon dating shows that most fossils accumulated between 40,000 and 10,000 years ago, with peak deposition occurring during the last ice age. During this period, the climate was cooler and wetter, causing more surface water to accumulate over tar, making the traps even more deceptive. Animals from wide geographical areas apparently visited these water sources repeatedly, generation after generation, dying in the same locations where their ancestors perished. The fossil record preserves this grim consistency. thousands of deaths spread over millennia, each victim contributing bones to a growing cemetery that would eventually tell scientists the complete story of life and death in Pleistocene California. Frozen in ice caves. Ice caves created unique preservation environments where animals became trapped, froze to death, and remained frozen for thousands or millions of years, protecting soft tissues, DNA, and even stomach contents that normally decay within days. These natural freezers preserved creatures with such fidelity that scientists could study their last meals, analyze their microbiomes, and in some cases extract viable genetic material. The deaths these caves recorded were typically slow. Animals fell through skylights or entered seeking shelter, then found themselves unable to escape as temperatures dropped and ice formed around them. The most spectacular ice cave fossil site is in the Ural Mountains of Russia, where Imanai Cave has preserved more than 50,000 animal bones spanning the past 50,000 years. The cave's vertical entrance acted as a pitfall trap. Animals stumbling into the opening plunged into darkness and landed on ice-covered rock 30 meters below. Broken bones in many fossils indicate the falls were fatal or severely crippling. Those that survived the impact found themselves trapped in a chamber where temperatures remained below freezing year-round. Without food, water, or exit routes, they died slowly from injuries, starvation, or hypothermia. The frozen environment mummified their bodies, preventing decomposition and preserving them in three-dimensional detail. Cave bear fossils dominate Imanai's collection, with thousands of complete skeletons representing multiple generations. These massive herbivores apparently used the cave for winter hibernation, but occasionally fell through the entrance or became disoriented and ended up in areas where they couldn't escape. Their skeletons show they died in various positions, some lying down as if sleeping, others standing or sitting, frozen in place as they weakened. Bone pathologies reveal that many cave bears suffered from tooth decay and jaw infections caused by cave-dwelling diets, suggesting those using caves for extended hibernation had worse dental health than those hibernating elsewhere. Another remarkable ice cave site exists in Wyoming, where natural trap cave claimed victims for hundreds of thousands of years. The cave's entrance is a 15-meter deep sinkhole, barely visible from ground level, camouflaged by vegetation. Animals walking across the surface suddenly found ground disappearing beneath them, plunging into the cave below. The cave's cool, dry environment naturally mummified many carcasses, preserving hair, hooves, and ligaments alongside bones. Excavations recovered American lions, short-faced bears, cheetahs, horses, camels, and woolly mammoths. A complete cross-section of Pleistocene megafauna. One of Natural Trap Cave's most significant discoveries was a nearly complete American lion skeleton, with preserved soft tissues, including dried muscle and connective tissue. This specimen allowed researchers to study muscle attachment patterns and reconstruct the animal's range of motion and hunting behaviors with unprecedented accuracy. Analysis revealed the American lion was more robustly built than modern lions, with relatively shorter legs but more massive shoulder muscles, suggesting it hunted using power and grappling rather than pursuit and speed. European ice caves preserve similar stories. Romania's Scaricioara ice cave contains bears, wolves, and various smaller mammals that fell through entrance shafts and froze. Some fossils date back more than 3,000 years, yet they remain frozen in blocks of ice that have never melted. Studies of these specimens show that climate changes affected ice cave preservation. During warmer periods, ice partially melted and refroze, damaging earlier fossils, while during colder periods, preservation improved and more animals became trapped as harsh weather drove them to seek any available shelter. The Siberian permafrost functions similarly to ice caves, but on a landscape scale. Entire frozen mammoths have been recovered from permafrost, some so well preserved that their eyeballs, tongues, and stomach contents remained intact. One remarkable mammoth specimen, called Liuba, was so perfectly preserved that scientists could examine her internal organs, identify the milk in her stomach, and determined she died at approximately 1 month old, probably after falling into mud and suffocating. Her preservation was so complete that researchers could study skin bacteria and reconstruct details of mammoth biology impossible to determine from bones alone. Another Siberian find, called the Jarkov mammoth, remained frozen with intact hair covering and skin still attached to the skull. Excavation teams used hairdryers to carefully melt the surrounding ice, revealing layers of preserved tissue that provided DNA samples and tissue for cellular studies. The mammoth's last meal remained in its digestive system, fragments of grass, flowers and mosses that allowed botanists to reconstruct the vegetation composition of the late Pleistocene tundra with direct evidence rather than inference. The deaths recorded in ice caves and permafrost were often protracted and miserable. Animals with broken legs from falls couldn't move to find water. Those trapped in small chambers slowly starved while remaining conscious. Hypothermia killed gradually, with victims remaining alert for hours or days as their body temperatures dropped and cellular functions shut down. Unlike violent deaths that ended in seconds, these were slow declines where animals had time to struggle, to attempt escape, and to eventually accept that escape was impossible. The preservation quality is a bitter trade-off. The same freezing conditions that killed these animals also saved their remains for science, turning their suffering into data points that illuminate prehistoric ecosystems. Some of the most unusual deaths in the fossil record involved animals accidentally impaling themselves on sharp objects or becoming pinned between rocks, logs, or other obstacles, freak accidents that trapped victims and prevented escape until death from starvation, predation, or exposure. These fossils are rare because the circumstances required for their preservation are highly specific, but when discovered, they provide dramatic evidence that prehistoric life was full of hazards that had nothing to do with predators or environmental catastrophes. One remarkable specimen from Mongolia preserves a small dinosaur called Sinornithomimus, trapped between two large rocks that apparently shifted and crushed the animal. The fossil shows the dinosaur's body compressed laterally, with ribs on one side intact and those on the other side shattered from the crushing force. The animal's neck is extended and its mouth open, suggesting it struggled briefly before dying. Sediment analysis indicates the rock shifted during a seismic event, a small earthquake that moved boulders just enough to trap the dinosaur in a gap it was passing through. Another impalement fossil comes from Germany, where a Jurassic crocodilian fossil preserves a sharp wooden spike driven through its body cavity. The spike, now mineralized, entered through the animal's underside and exited through its back, suggesting the crocodilian either fell onto the spike from above or was driven onto it by water currents during a flood. The wood fragment's orientation and the surrounding rock indicate the crocodilian remained impaled for days or weeks before dying, with new bone growth around the entry wound showing the animal's body attempted to heal the catastrophic injury before infection or organ failure proved fatal. Pterosaur fossils occasionally show similar accidents. One specimen from Brazil preserves a small pterosaur with its wing membrane torn and wrapped around a mineralized tree branch. The animal apparently flew into the branch during a storm, or while fleeing a predator, became entangled and hung there until death from exposure or predation. The preservation includes the branch and the pterosaur in the same rock layer, their spatial relationship exactly matching an entanglement scenario. The pterosaur's bones show no other injuries, suggesting it didn't fall from a height, but rather became trapped while trying to land or maneuver through dense vegetation. Marine fossils preserve their own versions of these accidents. A fossil turtle from Kansas shows the animal wedged into a narrow crevice in ancient reef rock. The turtle apparently swam into the crack, perhaps chasing prey or fleeing danger, and found itself unable to back out or turn around. Its front flippers are extended forward in a swimming motion, suggesting it continued trying to push through even as the crack narrowed. The turtle's skeleton shows stress fractures in the shell edges, where it scraped against rock during escape attempts. Death probably came from exhaustion or drowning when the turtle could no longer keep its head above water. Another marine accident involves a fish fossil from Wyoming's Green River Formation, showing the animal trapped inside the jaw of a much larger predatory fish. Unlike the earlier discussed fish within a fish, choking deaths, this specimen shows the small fish wedged sideways in the predator's mouth, rather than being swallowed. The predator's jaws are locked open, unable to close around the prey's awkward position. Both fish died, the prey from being crushed and bitten, the predator apparently from inability to dislodge the prey or close its mouth, leading to gill damage and suffocation. Land mammals occasionally died from similar bizarre accidents. A Miocene horse fossil from Nebraska shows the animal with its hoof trapped in mineralized wood. Apparently, it stepped into a hollow log that rotted partially, creating a hole that looked solid but collapsed when the horse's weight hit it. The horse's leg bones show spiral fractures typical of twisting injuries, suggesting it struggled violently to free its trapped hoof, breaking its own leg in the process. Unable to flee predators or reach food and water with 3 functional legs, the horse died near where it was trapped. Paleontologists studying these accident fossils note they represent only a tiny fraction of similar deaths that occurred but weren't preserved. For every fossilized impalement or entrapment, thousands of similar accidents left no trace because bodies decomposed normally without rapid burial. The fossils we do find represent extraordinary luck. Accidents that occurred in environments where sediment quickly covered victims, where geological conditions favored preservation, and where erosion later exposed fossils at times when humans were present to discover them. These accidents also reveal behaviors and habitat uses that wouldn't otherwise be obvious from bones alone. A dinosaur found crushed between rocks indicates these animals used narrow passages between boulders, perhaps as shortcuts or escape routes. A pterosaur tangled in branches shows these flyers navigated through dense vegetation despite wings that made such flying hazardous. A turtle wedged in reef cracks demonstrates these animals actively explored tight spaces while foraging. Each accident fossil expands our understanding of how extinct animals interacted with their environments, and how those environments could kill without warning. The emotional impact of these fossils comes from their randomness. Unlike predation deaths that follow evolutionary logic, predators evolved to kill, prey evolved to avoid being killed. These accidents show death arriving senselessly. A dinosaur taking a familiar path happened to pass through at the exact moment an earthquake shifted rocks. A pterosaur flying successfully for years hit one unfortunate branch. A horse survived countless steps into solid ground, but broke through on one unlucky attempt. These fossils remind us that survival in any era depends partly on luck, and that extinction can be personal and arbitrary long before it becomes evolutionary and permanent. Asphyxiation in ancient mudflows. Mudflows, dense, viscous slurries of sediment and water that flow downslope like wet concrete, created some of the most dramatic mass death events preserved in the fossil record. Unlike floods that move quickly and killed through impact or drowning. Mudflows advanced relatively slowly, but were impossible to escape because their density prevented swimming and their adhesion dragged victims down. Animals caught in mudflows died from asphyxiation as thick mud filled their airways, or from exhaustion as they struggled against material that fought every movement, or from being buried alive under meters of sediment that hardened around them as water drained away. The most extensive mudflow death assemblage comes from Nebraska's ashfall fossil beds, previously mentioned for volcanic ash deaths, but which also preserves a separate mudflow event that killed a different fauna assemblage. This mudflow deposit shows dozens of horses, rhinoceroses, and camels buried in orientations that indicate they were moving downslope when the flow overtook them. Their legs are extended in running positions, their heads thrown back, their mouths open, all indicators of animals desperately trying to keep breathing as mud engulfed them. Sediment analysis from mudflow deposits reveals the killing mechanism. The mud was dense enough to support large animals temporarily, keeping them partially above the surface, but fluid enough to prevent solid footing. Animals couldn't run, couldn't jump, and couldn't climb out. Each struggling movement drove them deeper as mud flowed into spaces their bodies created. Respiratory systems are clogged with fine particles. Weight increased as more mud accumulated on backs and heads. Eventually, even strong animals couldn't keep their airways clear, and death from asphyxiation followed. One particularly well-preserved mudflow victim from the Ashfall site is a pregnant rhinoceros whose skeleton shows her standing nearly upright in the hardened mud. Her ribcage expanded, suggesting she was taking a final breath when the mud hardened enough to support her body in that position. Inside her body cavity, a fetal skeleton is visible, also preserved in perfect articulation. Both mother and unborn offspring died together, trapped in a moving river of mud that solidified around them and preserved them exactly as they were at the moment of death. The mudflow's origin matters for understanding these deaths. Most paleontological mudflows originated in volcanic regions, where ash deposits became saturated with rain, creating dense slurries that raced downslope. Others formed when earthquakes triggered slope failures, sending water-saturated sediment flowing into valleys. Still others developed when glacial ice dams broke, releasing floods that mixed with loose sediment to create mudflows. Regardless of origin, the result was the same: a slow-moving but unstoppable wall of thick mud that buried everything in its path. Mudflow deposits preserve social structures and behaviours visible in few other fossil contexts. The Ashfall rhinoceroses died as a herd, males, females and juveniles of various ages all together. Their orientations show they were moving as a group, with smaller individuals clustered near larger ones, suggesting family groups remained together even while fleeing. This provides direct evidence of Miocene rhinoceros social structure that couldn't be determined from isolated skeletons. Another mudflow site in Pakistan preserves a herd of elephant relatives called Gomphothoraes, also buried while apparently moving together. The Gomphothoraes show size gradations consistent with family groups including adults, subadults and juveniles. Their positioning suggests the herd was crossing a valley when the mudflow struck from a side canyon, cutting across their path and engulfing them before they could change direction. The preserved footprints leading into the mudflow deposit show the animals were walking calmly before the disaster, unaware of approaching danger until it was too late. Mudflow deaths weren't always dramatic group events. Some deposits preserve solitary individuals caught alone, perhaps animals that wandered into mudflow paths hours after the main flow passed, but while sediment remained fluid enough to trap them. These isolated victims show different death poses, often more contorted and desperate than herd victims, suggesting individuals fought longer before succumbing. One horse skeleton from Nebraska shows the animal twisted backward with its head bent at an impossible angle, indicating it struggled violently enough to dislocate its own neck vertebrae during its final moments. The preservation quality in mudflow deposits rivals volcanic ash for detail. The fine-grained, oxygen-poor sediment prevents decomposition effectively. Mudflows also buried animals quickly enough to prevent scavenging. Predators couldn't reach bodies sealed under meters of hardening mud. As a result, skeletons remain completely articulated, with even delicate bones like ribs, vertebrae, and toe bones in place. Some mudflow fossils preserve hair impressions or skin textures where the dense mud moulded around bodies before decomposing. Scientists studying mudflow assemblages can reconstruct precise death sequences. The distribution of fossils within the flow indicates where animals were when caught. Those found at flow edges were probably fast enough to nearly escape, but were overtaken at the last moment. Those in the centre were caught earlier and had no chance. The depth of burial correlates with animal size. Larger animals protruded further above the flow and remained visible longer before being completely covered. These patterns allow researchers to virtually rewind the disaster and understand exactly how it unfolded over minutes or hours, turning chaotic death scenes into comprehensible narratives preserved in stone. Poison gas death valleys. Volcanic gases occasionally accumulate in low-lying areas, creating invisible death zones that kill silently and indiscriminately. The fossil record preserves several examples of mass death events where hundreds of animals died in concentrated areas without physical trauma, without evidence of drowning, and without signs of disease, deaths that paleontologists interpret as gas poisoning from volcanic emissions. These fossils capture moments when invisible killers struck entire ecosystems, leaving victims in place with no external injuries, but completely lifeless. The most famous modern analogue is Lake Nyos in Cameroon, where in 1986, a sudden release of carbon dioxide from volcanic activity beneath the lake created a ground-hugging cloud of gas that rolled downhill and asphyxiated 1,700 people and thousands of animals. The gas was invisible and odorless. Victims had no warning. They simply collapsed and died as carbon dioxide displaced oxygen in their lungs. This disaster provides a model for interpreting fossil assemblages that show similar patterns: mass deaths with no trauma and no signs of struggle. One such fossil assemblage comes from the Oligocene of France, where a volcanic crater lake deposit preserves hundreds of mammals, birds, reptiles and amphibians that died simultaneously. The animals show no injuries, no evidence of drowning, and no signs of being buried alive. Instead, they appear to have simply fallen dead where they stood. Geological evidence indicates the lake underwent a limnic eruption, a sudden overturn of deep water layers that released dissolved carbon dioxide in massive quantities. The gas rolled across surrounding land, killing everything in its path within minutes. The victims' postures provide clues about how quickly death arrived. Most animals are preserved in natural standing or walking positions, rather than contorted struggling poses. This suggests they lost consciousness almost immediately and collapsed where they stood. Birds are found on the ground rather than showing any signs of flight attempts. Small mammals are curled in sleeping positions. The speed of death prevented defensive reactions or escape attempts, creating an assemblage that looks eerily peaceful despite documenting a catastrophe. Another poison gas deposit exists in Germany's Messel pit, where volcanic activity periodically releases hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide into the crater lake and surrounding areas. The Messel deposits preserve multiple layers of mass death, each representing a separate gas release event. The victims include horses, primates, bats, birds, and insects. Diverse fauna, suggesting the gas clouds didn't discriminate between species or habitats. The repeated nature of these events indicates the area was chronically dangerous, yet animals continued returning and recolonizing between disasters. Scientists studying Messel fossils note that some animals apparently sensed danger and attempted to flee. A few specimens are found at the edges of mass death zones, in positions suggesting they were moving away when gas overtook them. Others show signs of attempted flight: birds with wings extended, horses with legs positioned mid-gallop. But most victims show no escape attempts, suggesting either the gas rendered them unconscious before they realized danger, or that it killed too quickly for reactions to develop. The composition of death assemblages provides information about ecosystem structure at the moments of catastrophe. Messel deposits include both diurnal and nocturnal species in the same death layers, suggesting some gas releases occurred at dawn or dusk, when both day-active and night-active animals were present simultaneously. The inclusion of bats found outside roosting sites indicates some events happened during evening hours when bats were actively foraging. These details allow scientists to reconstruct not just what lived in ancient ecosystems, but when species were active and how communities functioned on daily cycles. Poison gas deaths also affected marine environments. Some fossil assemblages from ancient anoxic basins show mass mortality events where fish and invertebrates died suddenly when deep water mixing brought hydrogen sulfide-rich water to the surface. Unlike terrestrial gas deaths, these marine victims often show more distress in their death poses. Fish with mouths agape, bodies contorted, suggesting they remained conscious longer as toxic water burned their gills and tissues. The transition from normal ocean water to poisoned water wasn't instantaneous, like a gas cloud arrival, giving victims time to react, but not enough time to swim to safety. The horror of poison gas deaths lies in their invisibility and inevitability. Victims had no way to sense approaching danger. Unlike floods, fires, or volcanic eruptions that announce themselves with sound, heat, or visual cues, gas clouds arrived silently and invisibly. Animals living their normal lives, eating, sleeping, walking, flying, suddenly found themselves unable to breathe, their nervous systems shutting down, their consciousness fading. Those that survived by chance were those outside the gas cloud's reach, saved not by speed or strength, but by random geographical positioning. These deaths weren't battles with winners and losers, but lottery draws where location determined everything, and adaptation meant nothing. The fossils preserve this randomness. Diverse species from varied habitats all killed together, their only commonality being they happened to occupy the wrong place at the wrong moment. Locked in amber for millions of years. Amber, fossilized tree resin, creates a unique preservation environment that captures small animals in three-dimensional detail, often preserving soft tissues, colors, and even behavior. These aren't deaths from predation or disaster, but from unfortunate encounters with sticky resin flows that trapped insects, spiders, small vertebrates, and other creatures. The victims died slowly, often struggling for hours or days as they remained adhered to resin, their final movements frozen forever when the resin hardened into amber. The most spectacular amber fossils come from Myanmar, where Cretaceous amber deposits preserve organisms from 99 million years ago. These deposits have yielded feathered dinosaur tails, complete lizards, primitive birds, and thousands of insect species. The preservation is so complete that scientists can examine individual feather barbs, scale patterns, and muscle tissues. One remarkable specimen preserves a baby bird with its wings spread, every feather visible, showing coloration patterns through preserved melanosomes, the cellular structures that produce pigmentation. The death process in amber was gradual and horrific. Tree resin flows slowly, accumulating in droplets or sheets on bark surfaces. Small animals walking on bark or flying near trees occasionally contact fresh resin. The initial contact is deceptive. The resin seems only slightly sticky. But as the animal tries to pull away, more surface area makes contact. Struggling creates vibrations that attract predators, making trapped animals vulnerable to being eaten alive. Those that survive predation remain stuck, sometimes for days, unable to escape as the resin hardens around them, and asphyxiation or dehydration brings death. Amber fossils frequently show animals in mid-struggle. Insect specimens have legs extended, trying to push away from the resin. Spiders show defensive postures with fangs extended. Some specimens preserve multiple animals trapped together. Predators that approached trapped prey and became stuck themselves, creating predator-prey pairs frozen in amber. One famous specimen shows an ant trapped alongside the parasitic mite it was carrying, both preserved with such detail that scientists can identify the mite species and study its attachment structures. The Myanmar amber deposits also preserve vertebrates, though rarely. One specimen contains a partial dinosaur tail approximately 37 millimeters long, covered in feathers with preserved coloration showing chestnut brown upper surfaces and pale undersides. The tail vertebrae and soft tissues remain visible through the transparent amber, providing direct evidence of dinosaur feather structure and pigmentation impossible to determine from compressed fossils in rock. This dinosaur probably brushed against a resin flow while moving through vegetation, left behind a portion of its tail, and escaped, injured but alive, leaving its tail tip preserved for science. Another extraordinary find is a complete baby snake preserved in amber, showing scales, vertebrae, and even traces of internal organs. The snake apparently crawled into a resin pool while hunting insects or exploring its environment, became trapped and died as resin flowed over its body. The preservation includes enough detail that scientists identified it as a new species and could determine it was only days old when it died, based on bone development patterns. This fossil provides information about juvenile snake anatomy and development that couldn't be obtained from adult specimens. Amber preservation extends beyond whole organisms. Scientists have found preserved blood cells, microorganisms, plant tissues, and even DNA fragments in amber specimens. One mosquito fossil contains remnants of its last blood meal in its abdomen, though attempts to extract dinosaur DNA from such specimens have proven unsuccessful. DNA degrades too rapidly to survive millions of years even in amber. Nevertheless, proteins and other biomolecules have been identified, providing chemical information about extinct organisms' biology. The behavioural information preserved in amber is equally valuable. Some specimens show mating pairs of insects caught during copulation. Others preserve parasitic relationships, wasps laying eggs in aphids, mites attached to beetles. One specimen shows a spider that had just captured a fly, both caught in resin before the spider could consume its prey. These behavioural snapshots reveal ecological relationships that are difficult to infer from isolated fossils, demonstrating that amber preserves not just anatomy, but also interactions, relationships, and moments of prehistoric life. The emotional impact of amber fossils comes from their transparency. Unlike rock fossils that require preparation and imagination to understand, amber specimens are immediately visible in 3 dimensions, looking almost alive despite being tens of millions of years old. Viewing a feathered dinosaur tail or a complete baby bird suspended in golden resin creates an intimate connection to deep time, making extinction and fossilization feel immediate and personal rather than abstract and distant. These animals didn't die in catastrophes or battles. They died from simple accidents, their final moments preserved with such clarity that observers can see individual feathers, scales, and even facial expressions frozen in permanent detail. The Great Dying's victims. The end Permian mass extinction approximately 252 million years ago was the most catastrophic event in Earth's history, killing an estimated 90% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. The fossil record from this period preserves countless death assemblages, showing how ecosystems collapsed over thousands of years as volcanic eruptions in Siberia released massive quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and methane into the atmosphere. The resulting climate change, ocean acidification, and oxygen depletion created what paleontologists call the Great Dying, an extinction so severe that Earth's biosphere nearly failed completely. The victims preserved in end Permian rocks show signs of chronic environmental stress before death. Many skeletons display bone pathologies indicating malnutrition, disease, and developmental abnormalities. Tooth enamel in mammal-like reptiles shows stress lines from periods of starvation or illness. Growth rings in shells and bones reveal that animals took longer to reach maturity and lived shorter lives as conditions deteriorated. These aren't signs of sudden death, but of slow ecological collapse, where survival became increasingly difficult until populations could no longer sustain themselves. One particularly striking end-Permian fossil bed in South Africa preserves hundreds of Lystrosaurus, a pig-sized dicynodont that was one of the few species to survive the extinction. The assemblage shows individuals of all ages, from babies to adults, suggesting an entire population died together. Sediment analysis indicates they died during a drought, gathered around a shrinking water source that eventually dried completely. The animals show signs of severe dehydration, bone texture changes indicating stress, and positioning suggesting they died while trying to reach water. This wasn't death from volcanic eruptions or toxic gas, but from environmental changes that made basic survival impossible. Marine fossils from the end Permian tell equally grim stories. Reef deposits show sudden transitions from diverse coral and sponge communities to barren sea floors covered only by bacterial mats, a regression to conditions similar to much earlier in Earth's history. The final layers of diverse life preserve animals in death positions, indicating oxygen deprivation. Fish fossils show gasping postures with mouths wide open. Invertebrates that normally burrowed into sediment are found on sediment surfaces, suggesting they fled low oxygen bottom waters but found no refuge. These victims died from suffocation as ocean oxygen levels collapsed. The extinction didn't happen uniformly or instantly. Different regions and ecosystems collapsed at different times over approximately 60,000 years, geologically instantaneous, but long enough for multiple generations to suffer through worsening conditions. Early-stage fossil beds show reduced diversity, but still relatively healthy individuals. Middle-stage deposits show declining body sizes, suggesting populations were under nutritional stress. Final-stage beds show only a handful of species with signs of severe pathology before disappearing entirely from the record. Some victims show adaptations that proved useless during the extinction. Gorgonopsians, saber-toothed predators discussed earlier, were perfectly adapted for hunting large herbivores on stable floodplains. But as plant communities collapsed and herbivore populations crashed, these specialized predators had no prey base. Their final fossils show them in regions where they didn't normally occur, suggesting desperate attempts to find food in unfamiliar habitats. They survived millions of years of normal environmental changes, but couldn't adapt quickly enough when every ecosystem failed simultaneously. The few species that survived the end Permian did so, not because they were stronger or better adapted in traditional senses, but because they happened to possess traits useful in collapse conditions. Lystrosaurus was a burrowing herbivore that could dig for plant roots when surface vegetation died. Its modest size meant lower food requirements. Its ability to tolerate variable conditions allowed survival in unstable environments. These traits weren't advantages during normal times, but became critical when normal times ended. The fossil record preserves this reversal. Species that dominated for millions of years, disappearing while marginal species inherited devastated Earth. Recovery after the Great Dying took millions of years. Early Triassic fossil beds show extremely low diversity, with the same few species appearing worldwide. Lystrosaurus, a few small reptiles, and limited invertebrate fauna. These survivor species briefly filled multiple ecological roles they weren't adapted for, creating strange ecosystems that function poorly compared to pre-extinction communities. Slowly, evolution rebuilt diversity through survivors' descendants, but the world that emerged was fundamentally different from what existed before. The victims preserved in end Permian rocks represent not just individual deaths, but the death of entire evolutionary lineages, body plans, and ecological relationships that would never return. Cannibalism in the fossil record. Cannibalism, animals eating members of their own species, appears throughout the fossil record as a survival strategy, a social behavior, and sometimes as evidence of desperate starvation in collapsing populations. Fossils preserve cannibalism through distinctive bite marks, partially consumed remains showing feeding patterns matching the species itself, and occasionally through preserved stomach contents containing remains of conspecifics. These fossils reveal that eating one's own kind, while disturbing to human sensibilities, was neither rare nor necessarily pathological in prehistoric ecosystems. The most extensive evidence for prehistoric cannibalism comes from Tyrannosaurus rex fossils. Multiple T. rex bones show bite marks that precisely match T. rex tooth dimensions and spacing. The marks appear on facial bones, limb bones, and vertebrae, locations consistent with feeding rather than combat. Some marks are healed, proving the bitten individual survived and recovered, suggesting these were fighting injuries rather than feeding. But other specimens show systematic dismemberment patterns identical to those T. rex inflicted on prey species, strongly suggesting consumption of dead T. rex individuals by living ones. Whether this represents active hunting of other tyrannosaurs, scavenging of dead individuals, or infanticide remains debated. Some scientists argue tyrannosaurs occasionally killed and ate juveniles or weakened adults during territorial disputes. Others suggest tyrannosaurs simply didn't discriminate between dead meat sources. A dead T. rex was food just like a dead hadrosaur. Either way, the fossil evidence proves tyrannosaurs consume members of their own species with some regularity, making cannibalism part of their behavioural repertoire rather than an exceptional occurrence. Even more dramatic evidence comes from Herrerasaurus, one of the earliest dinosaurs from the Triassic. One specimen preserves a juvenile Herrerasaurus bone inside the stomach region of an adult Herrerasaurus. The bone shows digestive etching but remains identifiable as the same species. This direct evidence of cannibalism within one of Earth's first dinosaur species suggests the behaviour has ancient roots in dinosaur evolution, possibly inherited from earlier archosaur ancestors and maintained throughout dinosaur history. Marine reptiles also engaged in cannibalism. Mosasaur fossils occasionally preserve bite marks from other mosasaurs, and one spectacular specimen shows a smaller mosasaur preserved inside a larger individual's stomach cavity. Unlike accidental swallowing or interspecies predation, the size difference and species identity prove this was deliberate consumption of a juvenile conspecific. Marine environments may have encouraged cannibalism more than terrestrial ones, because prey distribution was patchy and opportunistic feeding was advantageous. Eating whatever protein was available, including members of one's own species. The most disturbing cannibalism evidence comes from ancient human relatives. Neanderthal sites in Europe preserve bones with cut marks, percussion fractures, and cooking traces indicating systematic butchery and consumption. The patterns match those seen on animal bones at the same sites, suggesting Neanderthals processed human remains using the same techniques they applied to deer or other game. Whether this represents ritualistic behaviour, starvation cannibalism, or routine dietary practice remains controversial, but the physical evidence is unambiguous. Neanderthals sometimes consumed other Neanderthals. Earlier hominin species show similar evidence. Homo antecessor fossils from Spain preserve cut marks consistent with defleshing and marrow extraction. The victims included children and adults, with all ages showing the same butchery patterns. The quantity of cannibalized remains and their integration into normal occupation layers suggest this wasn't emergency survival behavior, but something more routine, possibly territorial aggression, possibly nutritional opportunism, possibly cultural practice. The fossils document behaviors without explaining motivations, leaving modern observers to speculate about what drove ancient humans to consume their own kind. Invertebrates provide less emotionally charged but equally interesting cannibalism evidence. Trilobite fossils occasionally show bite marks matching other trilobite mouth structures. Since trilobites lack sophisticated hunting adaptations, this suggests either scavenging of dead trilobites or feeding on molts, shed exoskeletons that provided ready protein sources. Modern arthropods frequently consume molts and dead individuals, making this behavior likely in their ancient relatives. Amphibian fossils from Permian deposits show cannibalism patterns in Eriops, a large amphibious predator. Juvenile Eriops bones appear in adult Eriops stomach contents, and some adult skeletons show bite marks from animals their own size. This suggests both adult on juvenile predation and adult on adult fighting that sometimes escalated to consumption. The fossil evidence indicates cannibalism occurred across Eriops populations throughout their geographical range, making it a species-wide behavior rather than an aberration in specific populations. The evolutionary logic behind cannibalism is straightforward. Conspecifics represent protein sources just as valid as other prey, and in many cases more easily caught because they share habitats and behaviors. Predators that refused to eat conspecifics voluntarily surrendered nutritional resources to less squeamish individuals. Natural selection doesn't reward ethical behavior, it rewards reproductive success. And if eating one's own species increased survival and reproduction rates, the behavior persisted. The fossil record confirms this logic. Cannibalism appears in virtually every predatory lineage examined in sufficient detail, suggesting it's a default behavior that emerges whenever the costs, retaliation, disease transmission, reduced population don't outweigh the benefits, readily available protein, the last of their kind. Some fossils preserve not just individual deaths, but the deaths of entire species, the actual final individuals whose deaths meant extinction. Identifying such specimens is nearly impossible because the fossil record is so incomplete that last known fossil rarely equals last living individual. But occasionally circumstances combine to create strong candidates for true last of their kind specimens, fossils from the terminal layers of a species range, in regions where they persisted longest, showing signs of population stress that preceded extinction. One potential candidate is a woolly mammoth from Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean, where a dwarf mammoth population survived until approximately 4,000 years ago, long after mainland mammoths disappeared. The fossil shows an individual with severe skeletal abnormalities, including asymmetrical skull features and unusual bone growth patterns consistent with inbreeding depression. Genetic analysis of Wrangel Island mammoths confirms they suffered from extremely low genetic diversity, indicating tiny population sizes. This individual may have been among the final dozen or final 100 mammoths alive on Earth, part of a dying population struggling with genetic problems that made extinction inevitable. The circumstances of this mammoth's death remain unclear from fossil evidence, but the context suggests environmental stress. Wrangel Island's climate was changing, vegetation was shifting, and the mammoth population was too small to maintain genetic health. Whether this individual died from genetic defects, disease, starvation, or old age, its death contributed to a downward spiral. Each death reduced the population, shrinking the gene pool, increasing inbreeding, reducing fitness, causing more deaths. Eventually, perhaps within a human generation or two of this individual's death, the last mammoth died and the species vanished. Another candidate for last of their kind status is a Steller's sea cow skeleton from the Commander Islands, dated to the 1700s. Steller's sea cows were massive marine mammals discovered by European explorers in 1741. Within 27 years, the species was extinct, hunted to oblivion by Russian seal hunters who killed them for meat. The species had already been reduced to a tiny range by climate changes and human hunting before Europeans arrived. The fossils from the Commander Islands represent the final population, and individual skeletons from the latest layers might preserve actual witnesses to humanity's first documented extinction of a megafauna species. Caribbean monk seals provide another documented case. The last confirmed sighting occurred in 1952, and the species was declared extinct in 2008. Skeletal remains from museum collections represent some of the final individuals. These bones show no obvious pathologies or unusual features. The species didn't die from disease or genetic collapse, but from relentless hunting. Each skeleton represents not just an individual death, but a step towards species death, the cumulative effect of humans killing faster than populations could reproduce. The passenger pigeon offers the most precisely documented last-of-their-kind death. Martha, the final passenger pigeon, died in captivity in 1914 at the Cincinnati Zoo. Her preserved body remains in the Smithsonian collections. Unlike prehistoric extinctions where last individual remains unknown, Martha's death was witnessed, recorded, and memorialized. Her taxidermied body isn't technically a fossil, but serves the same purpose: physical evidence of extinction, a reminder that species loss is permanent and individual. The fossil record contains countless last-of-their-kind specimens that remain unidentified as such. Every extinct species had a final individual, a final population, a final breeding pair. Their fossils exist somewhere, embedded in rock or buried in sediment, preserving the exact moments when evolutionary lineages ended forever. Scientists occasionally recognize fossils from terminal layers as potentially representing final populations, specimens showing reduced size, pathological features, or limited geographic distribution consistent with populations under severe stress before extinction. One example is late surviving trilobites from the end Permian. The final trilobite fossils show dramatically reduced diversity compared to earlier periods. Instead of hundreds of species spanning varied habitats and body plans, the final layers preserve just a handful of species in limited environments. These terminal trilobites show small body sizes and limited geographic ranges, signs of populations contracting before extinction. Individual fossils from these final layers represent not just deaths, but endings. After these animals died, no more trilobites ever existed. 400 million years of evolutionary history concluded with these final individuals. The emotional weight of last-of-their-kind fossils comes from their finality. These weren't deaths followed by reproduction and continuation, but deaths that ended something permanent. Every adaptation that species evolved, every behavior it developed, every ecological role it filled, vanished when that final individual died. The fossil preserves not just morphology, but loss, potential that will never be realized, evolutionary paths that will never be explored, niches that will remain empty or be filled by totally different organisms. These fossils are tombstones for entire lineages, evidence that extinction is forever, and that evolutionary success guarantees nothing beyond the present generation. Entombed in limestone. Some of the most exquisitely preserved fossils come from limestone deposits formed in ancient lagoons, where chemical conditions allowed rapid mineralization of dead animals. These environments created fossil tombs that captured soft tissues, delicate structures, and even behaviors with extraordinary fidelity. The deaths recorded in limestone deposits were often peaceful, animals sinking to anoxic lagoon bottoms, where they remained undisturbed while calcium carbonate gradually replaced their tissues and transformed them into stone. The Solnhofen limestone in Germany represents the pinnacle of lagoon preservation. Deposited during the Jurassic approximately 150 million years ago, Solnhofen formed in a tropical archipelago with isolated lagoons that had limited connection to the open ocean. The water chemistry in these lagoons was unusual: high salinity, limited circulation, and bottom layers that were anoxic and poisonous to most life. Animals that died and sank to these bottoms entered an environment where decomposition occurred very slowly, and scavengers couldn't survive. Bacterial mats covered the bodies, and fine carbonate sediments gradually buried them in oxygen-free conditions that prevented decay. The most famous Solnhofen fossil is Archaeopteryx, the earliest known bird, preserved with feathers, wings, and skeletal structures visible in startling detail. Multiple Archaeopteryx specimens exist, each showing slightly different preservation. Some display individual feather impressions with barb patterns visible. Others show fossilized skin around the neck and body. One specimen preserves the animal's wishbone, a structure that connects birds to dinosaurs and proved critical in understanding avian origins. These fossils captured animals that likely drowned after falling into lagoons, sank to toxic bottoms, and mineralized slowly over thousands of years in chemically perfect conditions. Solnhofen also preserves pterosaurs with wing membranes intact, showing the exact structure of flight surfaces. Small dinosaurs appear with skin impressions, revealing textures and scale patterns. Marine reptiles show stomach contents, proving they fed on fish and squid. Insects preserve with wings extended, showing venation patterns and colour traces. The diversity and quality of Solnhofen fossils make it one of Earth's most important windows into Jurassic life, all because lagoon chemistry happened to be perfect for preservation. Another exceptional limestone deposit exists in Lebanon, where Cretaceous lagoons created similar preservation conditions. Lebanese limestone preserves fish in such detail that their last meals remain visible in their stomachs. Some fossils show fish that had just eaten other fish, with prey fish skeletons complete and identifiable inside predator body cavities. Others preserve fish with stomachs full of crustaceans or small invertebrates. The preservation is so fine that scientists can identify prey species, calculate predator diet compositions, and reconstruct food web structures with direct evidence, rather than inference. One Lebanese limestone fossil shows a fish fossilized while giving live birth. Several small fish emerge from the adult's body cavity, caught in the moment of delivery. This specimen proved that some ancient fish species bore live young rather than laying eggs, demonstrating reproductive strategies that wouldn't be obvious from morphology alone. The timing of fossilization, mid-birth, required extraordinary circumstances, the mother dying during labour and sinking immediately to anoxic bottom waters before birth completed or before scavengers arrived. Chinese limestone deposits from the Jahol group preserve early birds and feathered dinosaurs with similar quality to Solnhofen, but at much greater abundance. Thousands of specimens allow statistical analysis of populations rather than just individual anatomy. Scientists can determine age distributions, sexual dimorphism, seasonal variations, and population structures by examining large fossil collections. These deposits show that dinosaur extinctions didn't happen uniformly. Some species disappeared suddenly, others declined gradually, and a few persisted in refugia long after they vanished from most of their ranges. The death process in lagoon environments was typically slow. Animals that fell into poisonous lagoons would have suffocated as toxins damaged their respiratory systems. Those that drowned in normal water struggled until exhaustion, then sank. Marine animals that swam into dead zones suffered progressive oxygen deprivation, becoming disoriented and eventually losing consciousness. Unlike violent deaths that ended in seconds, lagoon deaths often took minutes or hours, giving animals time to experience their dying processes fully before consciousness faded and preservation began. The scientific value of limestone fossils extends beyond anatomy to behaviour and ecology. Stomach contents reveal diet. Body positioning indicates swimming motions or resting postures. Association of multiple individuals suggests social behaviours. The presence of juveniles with adults indicates parental care. Seasonal variations in fossil abundance reveal migration patterns. Each perfectly preserved death contributes data points that isolated bones cannot provide, transforming random deaths into systematic records of how ancient ecosystems functioned, how species interacted, and how life operated in worlds that vanished millions of years ago.